What should we do with the name of God as revealed in Exodus, whether it's in translation or the way we pronounce it in songs and to each other? When I saw the Lord in caps, that meant that it was the special divine name of God revealed to Moses. Now, this seemed strange and confusing to me, adding a level of complexity to understanding a Bible that was already difficult enough for a teenager to understand. So I don't remember when it was that I first heard the name Yahweh pronounced, but when I went to seminary, I quickly realized that it was an accepted pronunciation and spelling for God's name, especially in academic circles. I saw that commentaries used it regularly, and professors assured me that it was the most reasonable of the way it was originally pronounced. Now, to give you some background, this study arose because as my wife and I began creating the Aleph with Beth channel on YouTube, which is a video course that teaches Hebrew through comprehensible input, we came to the point where we realized that we needed to introduce the divine name. So we had to decide how we'd pronounce it in the videos.
כה אמר יהוה אלוהי ישראל.
Now, in his book on ancient Near Eastern worldview, John Walton writes, ancient cultures considered something to exist when it had a name and a function. The name is the God's identity and frames the God's existence. End quote. Now, it could be argued that in modern cultures, we are very much the same way. In the West, for example, we're obsessed with having special names for everything, from sicknesses to psychological conditions to personality types. So our impulse to name things and people is prominent across cultures today. This reality highlights the importance of careful and meticulous deliberation when we talk about translating and pronouncing God's name. Now, before we look at historical evidence outside the Bible, it's really important to frame everything by what we know from Scripture. Unfortunately, in the millions of books that have been written on the divine name, this is kind of an afterthought in many of them. And a lot of what I found in my research, I did not find in other books, especially in this part. So, here we go. Let's look first at the main text in this whole issue, which is Exodus 3:15. And we're going to discuss more about it later, but let's get started with this. It says, God speaking to Moses, "Say this to the people of Israel, Yahweh, the God of your fathers, the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, and the God of Jacob has sent me to you. This is my name forever, and thus I am to be remembered throughout all generations." So in Hebrew, the last sentence reads, Ze shemi le'olam, v'ze zichri ledor dor. So literally, this is my name forever, and this is my memorial / remembrance / mention to generation. So that's a very literal wooden translation. Now, some versions, like the Net Bible and the KJV, translate the word zichri as memorial. But the word in this context can be understood as implying the speaking of the name, since things that remain unspoken are usually lost in oral cultures. So, for this reason, the NIV translates it as follows: This is my name forever, the name you shall call me from generation to generation. Now, if we look at Holliday's Hebrew and Aramaic lexicon of the Old Testament, and we look at zecher, we see that it can mean the mention of a name. An example is in Deuteronomy 32:26, or the solemn naming or address of God, and it has the example of Exodus 3:15 where we're at. Now, in Isaiah 26:8, God's name and mention or remembrance are paired together, hearkening back, I think, to Exodus 3:15. So this is what Isaiah 26:8 says. O Yahweh, your name and remembrance are the desire of our soul. This is from the ESV. So that last part, your name and remembrance, that's the same word, zecher, that's occurring in Exodus 3. Now, Hosea picks up on Exodus 3:15 as well when he writes, Yahweh, the God of hosts, Yahweh is his memorial name. That's also ESV. So that's Hosea 12:5. Let me read it again. Yahweh, the God of hosts, Yahweh is his memorial name. Also, that word zecher occurring there. The psalmist also picks up the same theme in Psalm 135:13. So this is what he says there. Your name, O Yahweh, is everlasting. Your zecher, O Yahweh, your remembrance, throughout all generations. English versions can't seem to agree on a gloss for your remembrance in this verse. And so we have NASB saying your remembrance, we have KJV saying your memorial, and NET your reputation, NIV your renown, NLT your fame. So what's clear is that this verse is a restatement or summary of God's revelation of his name in Exodus. And it would be helpful to English readers, I think, to maintain the connection by translating zecher consistently in both places, both in Psalm 135:13 and other places, and then hearkening back to Exodus 3:15. Now, the seventh definition of zachar, the verbal root of the noun zecher, in the BDB lexicon, is this. Remember, to remember, with implied mention of object. So with the implied mention, you've got to remember by mentioning. Implication there. The word zachar, here translated mention, most often means to remember, recall, or even commemorate. Certainly Jeremiah is not proposing to disremember Yahweh, to forget as do the people. In this instance, the verb must have the connotation of mentioning. That connotation fits well with the parallel half line, refusing to speak in Yahweh's name. End quote. By whose name, then, should they swear, right? Scripture actually speaks very clearly to this question in Deuteronomy 6:13, which says, It is Yahweh your God you shall fear. Him you shall serve, and by his name you shall swear. And again in Deuteronomy 10:20, in case we missed it, you shall fear Yahweh your God. You shall serve him and hold fast to him, and by his name you shall swear. Jeremiah, as a faithful Torah student, also reiterates the importance of this. So hear what he has to say in Jeremiah 12:16. And it shall come to pass, if they will diligently learn the ways of my people, to swear by my name as Yahweh lives, even as they taught my people to swear by Baal, then they shall be built up in the midst of my people. Now this is a really, really cool thing. It's a surprising promise to restore the other nations along with Judah if they will learn the ways of Yahweh's people. So it's clear, it's really clear here that swearing by Yahweh's name constitutes an important mark of those who belong to and follow him. So now I want to take a look at some people in the Hebrew Bible who actually conform to Yahweh's desire that his name be used to swear or vow. Okay, and as we heard in Jeremiah, one of the vows or the formulaic oaths is to use the phrase, as Yahweh lives. Okay, so listen for that in some of these. Boaz says to Ruth in Ruth 3:13, as Yahweh lives, I will redeem you. So there's a good Israelite doing what Yahweh wanted him to do and swearing, using Yahweh as Yahweh lives, to promise this to her. Now, then we see in 1 Samuel 14:45, where the people say to Saul, shall Jonathan die, who has worked this great salvation in Israel? I'll leave it to you to fill in the context. I'm sure most of you are familiar with this story. Shall Jonathan die, who has worked this great salvation in Israel? Far from it. As Yahweh lives, there shall not one hair of his head fall to the ground. And then even Saul himself says to David in 1 Samuel 19:6, as Yahweh lives, he shall not be put to death. This is in a totally different context. Elijah says in 1 Kings 17:1, as Yahweh, the God of Israel lives, before whom I stand, there shall be neither dew nor rain these years, except by my word. And then in 2 Chronicles 18:13, we have the prophet Micaiah saying, as Yahweh lives, what my God says, that I will speak. So I find in these examples that it's clear that righteous men like Boaz and Elijah swore by Yahweh's name. And I think it's also worth noting that righteous men also used the name in formulaic greetings. Now, I'm sure a lot of you are wondering about all the objections and other topics involved in this discussion of the divine name. For example, what about the fact that the New Testament authors always use the title Lord in Greek to refer to God? What about the offense it might be to some people to pronounce God's name? And what about the meaning of God's name?